Today's webinar is titled We Had This Call, Strategic Storytelling in EMS, presented by Gary Heigel. I'm going to pass it over now to our presenter. Thank you, Gary, for being here with us today to share your knowledge and experience with us, and we look forward to the presentation.
Thanks, Rio. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for choosing to spend some time with us this morning and give me a little bit of your time. I will do my best to try and make this useful for you. This is a little odd for me doing this. This is a presentation I just did at the NAEMSE Symposium in Pittsburgh just last week. And most of my presentations are fairly interactive, kind of feed off the audience, like to get participation. And it's really odd doing this where I can't see any of you or hear any of you. So it's kind of a different format, but I am going to ask for some participation. So I got a couple questions, a couple things I would like some observations, thoughts from you, and I encourage you to use the chat and share when we get to that point. Quick intro, I've been in EMS for over 40 years, hard to believe, and been teaching full-time for about 20 as the paramedic program director at Rogue Community College, which is in Southern Oregon. And this is a topic that I'm somewhat passionate about. I've been doing talks and kind of exploring this idea of storytelling in EMS for a long time. And in the past, I've done some talks about storytelling in EMS as it relates to how we establish our culture, the stories we tell in the station, the stories we tell posted on a street corner, the stories we tell to the new people coming in. Storytelling creates culture, and it's no different in EMS than in any other culture. And so I like to try to bring in awareness to my students, to my instructors, to the people I work with, to be thoughtful about the stories we share, thoughtful about the stories you use, and mindful of the fact that they have a carry-on effect. They have much more of a trickle-down effect than we may realize. And whether those stories are strong, positive influences on a positive culture that we want to see in EMS, or something less positive, something more negative, something that just contributes to the burnout and the frustration and all the things that we know are not ideal about our field. The stories we choose to tell have an impact. All right, so with that, I'll get started here. So first, I want to tell you that yesterday was Monday. That may sound like an obvious statement, but I mean, yesterday was Monday. I had one of those days where there just isn't enough time in the day. It's just a long day in the office. Walked away, leaving all kinds of stuff unfinished, and I left my office, and it is beautiful outside, absolutely gorgeous. Blue sky, a little bit of puffy clouds. It's about 80 degrees, which is a much more mild temperature than we've had recently. Light breeze blowing. And so I decided to just kind of take a long route home just to de-stress a little bit. So I'm driving home. I head out through a rural area that's kind of a roundabout way to get to my house. And I'm just letting the stress go. My window's down. I'm feeling the breeze. I'm smelling fresh cut grass. Also smelling hemp, because the hemp grows in our area are very fragrant this time of year. But I'm seeing cornfields and rolling hills, and it's just absolutely beautiful. I can just feel the stress just leaving my body. And I get out in an area about 2 miles from my house, and there's an intersection I'm very familiar with. It's a four-way intersection. You can see a half mile each direction. And as I approach the intersection, it's a four-way stop. And I look and I can see there's no traffic coming. There's nobody behind me. There's nobody ahead of me. So I slow down, and then I just roll through the intersection and keep going. And I'm heading home and just relaxed and feeling so much better about my day. And I hear that whoop, whoop, and a sound of a siren. And I look in my mirror and, crap, there is a state trooper behind me with his lights on. I have no idea where this guy came from. I didn't see him, have no idea. And instantly my hands are sweaty. My heart's racing. And it doesn't matter if you're 16 or if you're 62. It's that moment that I'm feeling all nervous and tense, and so many things going through my head. And of course, the first one is what is this going to cost me? The next thought is what is this going to do to my insurance rates? Because it's been a few years since I've had a ticket, but I remember it took a few years before the impact of that on my insurance rates went away. So I'm stressing about that, and I pull over, and I'm stopped, and I've got my registration, my license in my hand, and I'm looking at the mirror, and the guy's not getting out of his car. And I'm like, okay, I know he's running the plate. I know he's checking to see if I'm a felon or something, or if the car is stolen. And so I'm waiting, and I'm waiting. And as I'm waiting, my heart rate has not come down, I'm sure. And I'm thinking, can I talk my way out of this? And the next thought is, do I play the EMS card? Is it going to help me or hurt me if I tell this guy, but I've been driving emergency vehicles for my entire adult life? And I'm not really sure if that's a good idea or not. And while I'm contemplating that choice, I look into my side view mirror and I see his door open up. And this man gets out of his car, and this guy is huge. And I'm not talking obese, I'm talking 6'6", built like an NFL linebacker. And for some reason, that makes it even more intimidating. I don't know why that intimidates me, but it does. And he gets out, he puts on his trooper hat and adjusts it. He adjusts his mirrored aviator sunglasses, and he saunters up to the car. And I try to put my most polite expression on, whatever that is. And he says, "Do you know why I stopped you, sir?" And I said, "Yeah, I know. I didn't come to a complete stop at that intersection. And I know." And he says, "You did not stop at all." I said, "Well, I know I should have stopped. I recognize that, but it was clear. I could see that it was safe. I slowed down. I slowed down enough to make sure it was safe. I'm a really safe driver. I wouldn't do anything foolish." He said, "Sir, that's a stop sign. You didn't stop." I said, "Yeah, I know, but I slowed down and it was safe. And I don't see why it's a big deal." And he said, "I'm going to have to cite you for failure to comply with the traffic control device." I said, okay, here we go. You ever have that voice in your head that's telling you to stop talking? I don't know if I don't have that voice or I just don't listen to it. But at this point, I said, "But come on, what's the difference? I slowed down. You know it's no big deal. Do you really need to cite me? I didn't stop, but I slowed down." And he looks at me and he steps back and he pulls his baton off his belt, steps towards the fender of my car. And I'm thinking, what the hell is going on? And he starts beating on the fender of my car. Wham, wham, wham. What are you doing? Stop, stop. And he says, "Do you want me to stop or do you want me to just slow down?" So this is the part where it's really weird not having an audience that I can hear, because I have no idea if any of you found that humorous at all or if anybody chuckled. It went over fairly well with a live audience. So hopefully you found that somewhat interesting. The point of the story is words matter, and stories have a way of getting people's attention. Stories have a way of connecting our listeners to what we're saying that no other form of lecture, PowerPoint, video, other strategies we use do not have the same connection. And there's reasons for that, and there's strategies that we can take advantage of that. So Ryan Avery is a professional storyteller. I think this was I missed my calling in life. I would have loved to learn how to do this and how to get that gig as a professional storyteller. Ryan Avery has won international competitions in storytelling, because there is such a thing. And he says that stories are how we learn, that every value you learned was through a story. Whether the Bible, the Quran, your grandmother, we're hardwired to want to experience and feel stories. Excuse me. I think that's really powerful, and it's important to remember. And if you think about it over the course of your own life, about everything that you've learned, if you think about your EMS career, how much of our day-to-day routine and the things that we do did we learn from a policy manual? How much did we learn from formalized FTO training about what the company expectations are, how you carry yourself in the community, how you interact with patients? There's so many of those subtle things that what you probably heard is, "Yeah, I don't care what's in the policy manual. Here's how we do things here." Those are the stories, and the stories that back it up and explain why we do the things we do. Those have power. Those have the ability to be retained and recalled when needed. I shouldn't say nobody, very few people memorize policy manuals and can pull them up verbatim, but people will be able to tell you the stories that framed the choices they make and the way that they do things. So when we think about storytelling, I asked this question at NAEMSE, and I'll ask it now and ask you to put it in the quote. And not just, I'm sure that in any audience of EMS folks, everybody likes to tell stories, or the large majority of us kind of enjoy telling stories. We're sort of wired that way, I think, to start with. But I want to ask, why or how do you like to use stories in your teaching? Just a quick note in there. Throw something in the chat. I'd like to hear some input from people on why you use stories, how you use stories, why that's an effective thing to use in teaching. And also feel free to add in the chat any challenges that you find. you tuned into this to hear a little bit about storytelling, or at least to get an hour of CE. So are there things about storytelling that you find challenging, that you're struggling with, or that you'd like to explore a little bit? Because hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end where we can kind of talk about that. All right, awesome. Thank you for participating. We got a few people here. Helps bring the real world to the classroom, and that is huge. Illustrating a concept for assessments, teaching assessments, and we'll kind of come back to how that can be a powerful tool. When it was a super impactful learning moment for me, and that is huge. And that's one of the key points I'm going to talk about, how we choose our stories that we know. Examples for a lesson, make it relatable, which those two are very similar. When they're pertinent to the material that's being taught. Awesome point, and I'll get to that, is we all know those instructors who just tell stories for the sake of telling stories that really aren't tied to what you're supposed to be teaching. There needs to be practical applications. I'm just reading through the chat here and give us a few minutes. We have plenty of time, so I want to see what else people have to say. They entertain while they educate, making lessons memorable. And there is a lot of good evidence out there that when people are entertained, when people are laughing, when people are engaged in positive ways, they learn more effectively, they retain information better, and they're more likely to recall it. So that's some of the power that's kind of wrapped up in this. It makes us approachable. Absolutely. I'll talk about that. Sharing humbling moments shows our students that we're real, that we also are not infallible. Things I learned the hard way. Those are the best stories. Someone said no place for stories in the classroom or education. I'll be interesting, William, to hear what you mean by that. And oh, you said you're just kidding. Okay. How do you overcome the negative stories that students have heard? And that's a great one. I'm gonna come back to some of these, like I said at the end. I've got some things that'll address several of these comments. And tie in totally to the theme and what I want to talk about. But I'll try to come back to a couple of them at the end if we have time. And I think the negative stories are a particular challenge because we're not the only storyteller. All right. We tell our stories to our students. If they're initial education, we're going to tell them stories, and then they're going to go out there and hear other stories. And I think maybe one of the challenges to that, as far as overcoming it, is we got to be good storytellers. We have to make the impact clear, the point clear. Maybe we choose our stories because we want to counteract some of the negative stories that we know or anticipate that our students are going to encounter. And we all have the instructor who just wants to talk about themselves. Thank you for that comment, Mariah. We have, and we all know that is not very effective, right? That's not learning. That's an instructor telling you how cool they are, which does not help. And I'll read this one more. It helps bridge the gap between textbook and what happens in real life. And that is powerful. Textbooks are very dry information, but how does that relate? How do I really use this stuff? What's really going to happen on the streets? Powerful way to illustrate those things. So before I get to further, I want to give credit to a couple of sources I used for this. And these are two books that I'll share here that are great. Kendra Hall, I went to the IMSH, the big international meeting on simulation, what was in San Diego in January. And if you ever get a chance, that is an awesome conference to attend. They have a little of everything simulation related and a lot of training related to it. The biggest vendor hall I've ever seen at any medical show. Really cool. She was one of the keynote speakers at that and talking about stories. Now, this book she writes is really fundamental. She's another one of these professional storytellers. And this book breaks down the fundamentals of storytelling. What I've done is taken this rather substantial book and tried to pull out some of the key points for us to think about as educators, trying to apply some of these concepts that I'm going to share. This is a very good book. It's more focused on business than teaching. So she's kind of focused on marketing and salespeople and how to grow your business more effectively through storytelling. But the same principles apply. Another book that's excellent is How to Tell a Story. This is actually from a group called The Moth. The Moth is started out as a group of people getting together and practicing storytelling, and now it is been around for a long time. There's radio shows, there's TV shows, there's podcasts, there's TED Talks. There's a whole variety of resources. And if you look for anything with The Moth in it, you can find some phenomenal resources. And what they do is they recruit people from all over the world to tell their personal stories, and they match them with coaches who help them figure out how to be better storytellers. So they know a little bit about effective storytelling. And this book also has some great tidbits, great information. And I pulled a few things from this one as well. So let's talk about what makes a great story. And what I'm going to do is break down the things we're going to cover today, and then we'll get to each one of those. So we'll talk about this is how you decide what makes a great story for your particular purpose. How do you find those stories? We'll talk about how you choose stories because that's different. We have stories, we have lots of stories, and I'll talk about kind of how you identify what are the stories. And then how you choose the stories. And a couple of you made comments kind of about this. That it has to fit. It has to fit the context. It has to fit the topic we're covering today. And we want to make sure that it's going to be appropriate. So you have to choose your stories. We'll talk a little bit about crafting your story. In other words, you have that story in your head. You remember why it was important to you. How do you turn that into an effective story that you can tell? And then I'll talk a little bit about telling your story. So kind of the storytelling approach strategy. I'm just going to touch on this slightly, but I'll tell you right now, what you should do if you feel like you could be a better storyteller is tap into the resources that are out there. There are some phenomenal TED Talk videos, YouTube videos. There are a lot of people out there and a lot of free resources that have great pointers that can help you become a more effective storyteller in terms of your delivery, your intonation, the way you emphasize key points or change the pace or the volume of your presentation, all those kind of things. So there's a lot of good resources out there, and that goes way beyond the scope of what we have time to talk about today. So when we talk about what makes a great story, Kendra Hall breaks it down into three components, and other folks that have studied storytelling talk about this as well, that there's three key phases. And the first phase is normal. So normal is what we do. Normal is everyday life. Normal is you're on the ambulance responding to another call for an unknown medical problem. Normal is just going through your day-to-day action. And then the second phase of a great story is the explosion or the moment, the meaningful moment. There has to be some event that makes this something other than just a normal day. And we'll talk a little bit about the significance of that or how you identify and develop the ways you want to explain that moment. But there has to be an explosion. There has to be something that happens. And then the third phase of the story is that new normal. So we've got going along with life as normal. Something happens, some meaningful thing happens that makes you go, oh, I'm never doing that again, or I'm always going to do that in the future, or I completely am changing the way I think about this thing that I thought I understood. That meaningful moment establishes how you move forward. And we'll talk about kind of how those strategies build in. Those are the three phases. It's normal, there's an event, and then there's the new normal. And it's really that simple in terms of crafting a story, which we'll talk about. The other key things to build a great story is you need identifiable characters. Oftentimes in EMS and in your EMS education stories, your identifiable character is either going to be you or your patient, or it may be your partner, it may be a family member, it may be someone you interacted with on a scene, it might be a supervisor and the way they interacted with you. But they're almost always in meaningful stories, stories that get people's attention, have characters. And the more your listener can relate to those characters, the better it's going to connect and the better they're going to remember it. You need to have that meaningful moment. As I said, that meaningful moment is that aha moment, that inspiration moment, that realization that I've just learned something and it's something I need to share, which is why I'm putting it into a story and doing it now. And then the final thing is details. And this is challenging because if you get too many details involved in your story, it can get really long and maybe kind of get off track. But details make a difference. So talking about the environment, talking about your mood, talking about a variety of things, and I'll kind of come back to this and touch on a few of these when we talk about how you actually craft your story. But the specific details surrounding the event, surrounding the normal that led up to the event, can also be really important to include. So where do you find your stories? And I would say if you're EMS providers, and a lot of you as educators have been EMS providers for a while, you have a lot of stories. You have a lot of stories to pull from. You have an amazing library of stories that caused you to learn the things that you do. We all know we had our initial training, we had our textbooks, and we all know that you get out there in the field and you go, oh my God, that's not what I thought it was going to be. We learned the important things about our job in the field. And so that's an important recognition that what we need to do, I think, for most of us, is a better job of writing down enough of a story that will remember that it is a good story. If you're still out in the field, if you're still running calls, when you go on that call, they go, oh, wow, that would be a great one for my students. Take a minute to put that in your phone, type it up, write it down, whatever you do to remember enough of the details so that later you'll know to come back to that story. There's a couple of lines that I really like, which is good judgment decisions come from experience. And I think it's fair to say that we all want our students to demonstrate good judgment. We all want our students to make good clinical decisions, good operational decisions. We want them making good decisions. And the ability to make good judgments and decisions comes from experience. But what is experience? Experience is the result of bad judgment and poor decisions. So those of us that have been out there a while have a lot of examples of bad choices. If you're willing to share those examples, if you're willing to share those real world impactful things where you went, oh crap, that was really stupid and I'm never going to do that again. Now I just discovered why they trained us over and over again to test the cuff on your ET tube before you intubate. And in my initial training, I thought that was silly. I don't have time for that. I need to get the tube. Until the first time I had a vomit-filled airway and a difficult intubation, and I got the tube and went to inflate the cuff, and it didn't hold air at all. And now I have a vomit-filled airway and an ET tube that's basically worthless that I need to pull and replace with another one. I share that story because as a young new paramedic, I thought that whole inflate the or test the cuff thing was just silly until it bit me in the ass. And so those are the kind of examples that we can share with students to make sure they understand why some of these things are important. That message, that story, and obviously it's an abbreviated version of it, but that's so much more powerful than standing up and reading to students or telling students it's really important that you do this thing. So a couple other ways you can kind of find those stories is think about what questions get asked the most. As a teacher, we know we have certain things that either a lot of students ask, or even if they don't ask, we find ourselves saying over and over and over again because they don't get it. They're not listening. They're not paying attention. They don't seem to get the messages. Those are the things that we should step back and say, well, if I've said this 3 times and nobody's remembering it, maybe I need to find an impactful way to say the same thing that they will remember. So those can be good clues. And if you can find stories that demonstrate the answers to those key things, that's going to be helpful. You also should ask yourself some questions, some kind of prompts that I like to use to just kind of remember what is going to help with this. When have you made a difference for a patient, for a partner, for a family member, for a coworker, whatever? When have you done something where you really know you made a difference? Because those are impactful things that we tend to remember. What motivates you? I think it's powerful, kind of back to how do we overcome some of the negative stories that people are going to learn. I think setting the tone in our classes of why I do this. I've been in EMS for over 40 years. I still think it's the coolest job in the world. And I tell my students that every year. And we need to explain to them why. We need to tell them the stories that make us believe that this is worthwhile and that what we do it matters. What was your worst day or experience on the job? Or what was your best day or your best experience on the job? Now, depending on that worst day, especially, that may or may not be a story you want to tell. But if it's something you're willing to share, these are the kind of things that tend to be impactful. What are you most proud of? And this is a good one too, is what was your most embarrassing moment? This comes back to one of the comments that someone made about allowing your students to relate to you, making us approachable, making us realize we're human, that we make mistakes. A lot of our students, and it took me a while teaching to realize this. I'm a pretty easygoing guy. I think I'm pretty approachable. And it was several years into my EMS training or being a paramedic program director that I got feedback on one of my surveys of classes. And like 2 or 3 students said that I was really intimidating. And that just blew me away because I don't think of myself as an intimidating person. But you have to remember that when we're the instructor, we're automatically on this pedestal. We're the person with all the knowledge. We've already done the job. We know all this stuff. And they're kind of putting us up on this elevated, unrealistic pedestal. Whatever we can do to bring ourselves down is helpful. Bring us, make ourselves real, make ourselves human. I'll share one example and I'll give you an abbreviated story, a version of this story, but I share this with every class, every year that I teach. Involves going on a call early in my career to a report of a man who had fallen off a ladder. And fortunately, it was about a 45-year-old gentleman who was very stable, and he had fallen off a ladder, landed on his driveway. He was complaining of head and neck pain, and my partner was teching the call, and I was kind of in the support role, and she's with the firefighters doing an assessment, and we were on a transporting ambulance, and she turns to me and says, yeah, we're going to do full C-spine on him. He's got neck pain. So I head to the ambulance to get the gurney and all of our immobilization equipment. And I get to the back of the ambulance and I open up the back door of our ambulance, and there is no gurney in my ambulance. You talk about a sinking feeling. So now I'm pulling out the backboard and the seat collar and immobilization stuff, and I'm carrying them all in my hands, walking back down the sidewalk to where our patient is. And the firefighters are looking at me like I've lost my mind because I didn't bring the gurney with me. And I didn't want to admit to them what was going on. So we told them they could clear and we'd handle it. And they're looking at us kind of puzzled, like, you don't want us to help you? Well, you want us to get the gurney before you leave? He said, no, we're good. And so I encouraged them to leave the scene, which they did. The entire time, my partner Lori is looking at me like I've lost my mind. And then I inform her that she left the gurney at the last hospital because, of course, it wasn't my fault. It was her fault. And, of course, the patient wanted to go to a hospital that was on the opposite side of town from where we had left the gurney, which just added to the inconvenience and embarrassment of this entire situation. So we mobilized him, put him on a backboard, carried him, put him on the bench seat of the ambulance and strapped him in and took him to the hospital. But that was a humbling experience. And what I share with my students is that in the next 35 years of ambulance operation work, I think there might have been 2 or 3 times ever that I went on a 911 response without looking over my shoulder to see if there was a gurney in the back of the ambulance. I don't want my students to have that experience. I'm totally okay with telling my students about something foolish that I did, and it brings it to life. It reinforces that point about checking your ambulance, checking your equipment, making sure you have the things that you need. And I'm sure in a group like this with a whole lot of educators, it would be amazing. And one person already said they had the same gurney experience in '99, which was a few years after mine. But I'm sure that a lot of us have gone on a call without a monitor, or back in the Life Pack 10 days or Life Pack 5 days, rather, gone without your batteries for your monitor, or you get on scene and realize you don't have your med bag or whatever. Things happen. Those are important lessons. And if we're willing to share when we screwed up, it helps other people understand. So once you kind of build this library, and you already have them, it's a matter of kind of pulling them out and making a list, thinking about the things that you learned and the things you want to share, or the things that will illustrate things. I think when it comes to choosing the stories you're going to use, it's really important that we think about who our audience is, because obviously these stories that are appropriate, the lessons that are appropriate for a paramedic continuing education class with seasoned providers, are going to be very different stories than what you teach to initial EMT education or an EMR class or even initial paramedic class. We need to think about our audience and what do they need to learn, just like every other lesson we approach. What are the objectives? What am I wanting them to learn by the end of this process, so that I can make sure I'm targeting my story appropriately, or choosing a story that targets that. And that comes back to, what exactly do you want them to learn? And this should be tied to our learning objectives, right? This is the key to making sure this isn't just story time for the sake of story time. This is as you're building your lesson plan, just like you think about, I think I'll find a cool video that demonstrates this thing. I think I'll have them work in groups and challenge each other because that'll reinforce this point. Whatever your strategies are, stories should be one more of those strategies. And you should think, how am I going to get them to recognize the importance of bringing that suction unit to every patient where they might have to do airway management? And I've got stories that illustrate that really effectively, right? And so those are the kind of things that little story, it does not have to take a huge amount of time. Many of these effective stories can be condensed down to a 3-minute, 4-minute story. It does not need to take 20 minutes of your class time, because most of us don't have extra class time. We're constantly facing this EMS education challenge of, if you're going to add something new, you have to decide what you're going to take out, because we can't just add time to our classes. And so that's still true, but using stories effectively can be tiny little chunks of time that replace another way of presenting the information. So you don't have to think of adding this, it's replacing it with a more effective delivery method for some of these key points. So to keep this moving along, I'm going to go ahead and start talk now a little bit about crafting the story. Well, actually, no, I'm sorry. I was looking at my time. Let me go back for a second to this piece. When you're choosing stories, it's really important to make sure that our motivation for telling the story is tied to the learning objectives and that the story fits the situation. It's also appropriate or necessary that we make the story fit the situation. And I think it's okay sometimes to tweak some of the details. Stories are absolutely the most powerful when they are real, when they're real events, real things that had a real impact. They will convey that way more effectively. They're more likely to be effective. You can't just make stuff up and expect it to have the same sort of impact. You can't make a fictional story up and say, I swear this really happened, and then launch into a fictional story. You lose credibility very quickly. However, you can make some adjustments, I think, to stories, tweak little details to help emphasize the points that are there or could be there. Oftentimes we have those learning experiences where we go, wow, if that little thing had just gone a little bit more wrong, that would have been a disaster and I got lucky. So maybe you tweak the story a little bit to make it kind of move that direction before you figured out what you needed to do. It's okay. We have that license, if you will, to be a little creative in our stories because we're not creating a biography that we're going to have someone challenge. We're creating an educational tool. We're trying to make a tool that's going to effectively impact or deliver the messages that we're trying to do. So my story, example of that I'll use is for when I started out teaching, when I was a new instructor, I love to tell a story about, we got into trauma and we're talking about trauma. I love to tell a story about a trauma call I had early in my career. This was in Oakland, California. And we used to listen to scanners. And so we would jump the scanners, we'd listen to law enforcement because they would always get dispatched before ambulance or fire. And so my partner and I were out cruising and we're listening to a scanner and we hear law enforcement get dispatched for a shooting and it's not far from where we are. And so we start rolling that direction to get close. By the time dispatch toned us, gave us the information, and finally stopped talking on the radio, we jumped on the radio and said, copy en route on scene. So our dispatch time and our on scene time were identical because by then we were on the scene. We had already heard that law enforcement had secured the scene. And so we got on scene. Patient had been shot multiple times. And my whole focus of my story was about scene time. And with this particular call, from our dispatch time to delivery at the trauma center, which was about 4 blocks away, was 12 minutes. And within that 12 minutes, we started 2 IVs. We got the mask pants on. We had run in almost 2 liters of fluid, and we had the patient on oxygen. Back when we thought all those things actually were important and made a difference. And I realized after telling that story a few times that what I was really trying to do is show these people how cool I was and how what hot shit paramedics we were, because we could run an entire trauma call start to finish in 12 minutes and do a whole bunch of stuff. But when I really sat back and looked at that, what's the learning there? What is the benefit? What are my students getting out of that other than that I think I'm really cool at running trauma calls, right? There's no educational benefit there. And moving forward, the story that made sense and illustrated good treatment strategies in 1986 is totally irrelevant today. And someone said, what are mask pants? I'm glad you're kidding, but it's not really out of line, right? So we used to think those were really good things. And we took a lot of pride in being able to do them effectively. But we need to, as we choose the stories, make sure, is it time to retire that story? I've got a lot of really old stories that I just shouldn't tell anymore. And that's okay. But it's back to that being strategic about which ones you're going to use. All right, so moving on. Now I want to talk a little bit about crafting your story. So if you've picked your story, you've thought about this thing, whatever the example is you're teaching airway management and you remember that nightmare airway call where you learned the importance of bringing your suction unit to the scene, that sort of thing. The first part of crafting your story is that middle part. Right? So I said there's normal, there's an explosion, and there's a new normal. Well, normal is boring. If there isn't an event, if there isn't a meaningful moment, if there isn't something that happened, there isn't a story. So as you're crafting your story, that's the logical place to start. Think about that moment. Why did it matter? Why was it impactful? What were you thinking at the time? What were the lessons you learned? In your brain, really flesh that out, that the number one thing I walked away from this is I am never going to do that again, or whatever the learning point is, because you want that really clear in your head as you build your story. So that's where you want to start, is identify what occurred, what was the impact. And after you've defined that pivotal moment, after you think you've got a pretty good handle on what it is you want to make sure they understand, then you're going to go to part two, which is normal. And in the normal part, this is where we want to suck them into the story. This is where we want to put them in that moment. They need to be in that time, in that place, in that location. And this is where a lot of the details matter. This is where developing the characters and thinking about the details is key, because those details should include the time, the place, the weather. Was it at nighttime? Was it dark? Was it cold? Was it hot? All those things that sort of set the tone of the experience that you had are going to be powerful in connecting with your patient. A key part of that is sharing your thoughts, sharing what you were thinking, sharing what you were feeling. And we want to identify, not by saying, here's what's important, but built into our story of what's going on is we want to make sure that students understand what the stakes were. If there's nothing at stake, if there's nothing consequential, then the story doesn't have as much impact. So in the example of the airway, an airway challenge, that lead up could include, we walked in to a patient who is blue. He is absolutely cyanotic. I can't see air movement. His chest is barely moving. There's vomit everywhere. His O2 sat won't register on our monitor at all. You're setting up the tone of, oh my God, if I don't fix this situation right now, there's going to be horrible consequences for this patient, right? These are the stakes. This is why the next part of the story is something you want to pay attention to, building up that anticipation. Audiences love the sense that everything's going along as planned, but they know something's about to happen. As you build that thing, they know there's something coming, and it gets them on the edge of the seat. It gets them paying attention instead of falling asleep or on their phone or doing something else. There's great questions someone just put in the chat about culturally appropriate things. And if I don't remember that myself, please remind me when we get to the end here, because I think that's a great thing for us to chat about a little bit. So part one was we identified what is that big event. Part two is we suck them into the story. Tell them what was going on. What was the day? What was the mood? What were you doing at the time that this thing happened? Make them picture themselves in your shoes doing that same thing. And then part three is where we take that explosion and connect it up to the new normal, right? So now what's interesting about this is if you do this effectively, this is probably the shortest part of your story. Oftentimes, if you have to stop and say, the moral of the story is, you probably really haven't delivered that message very effectively, right? Most of the time, if we've delivered that aha moment, your audience, your students are going, oh, I get it. I don't want to do that, or I want to do that. Whatever, that impact should be there. They should recognize why that moment was meaningful and what you learned from it without you spending a lot of time on that part. Now, there are times when you might need to be very specific. You might, as part of your lesson, say, and that is why I will never again go to a patient's side without a suction unit close by. One line message, this is the point. That's okay, and that can be impactful. And if you've done your story well, they already know what you're going to say before you deliver that line. So that was kind of a really short synopsis. Like I said, take advantage of some of these resources if you want to learn more about this, because there's I just condensed 100 pages of that book into 3 slides. There's some really good information out there about how to build stories effectively. And we're going to touch on this just a little bit. Like I said before, there are also phenomenal resources out there for storytelling and storytelling strategies and that sort of thing. I encourage you to take advantage of it. But one of the biggest keys is you need to practice. Practice, practice, practice. You want to practice your storytelling. Think about how you do it. Run a stopwatch while you're doing it. Keep track of the time. See how long it takes you to deliver what you want. And we used to say, do this in front of a mirror. And that's not a bad strategy, but I find it kind of distracting trying to watch myself and focus on what I'm saying. I think what's a lot more effective today is do it in front of your computer. Turn on that camera or use your phone or whatever. We all have access to lots of video capture capabilities. So just set up a recording device and tell your story, and then watch it back. If any of you have not done that in your teaching, I strongly encourage you to do that. Setting up and filming yourself teach a class and then watching it can be a humbling experience if you've never done it before. I find myself constantly going, why do I keep doing that thing with my hand? I got to stop doing that. Or I didn't know I sounded like that. It's very interesting if you're able to do that and do it objectively. And in stories, we're talking about short little stories that you can practice and then watch it back and go, oh, I should have said that before that. Or you will notice things about your story that you probably don't recognize in the process of telling it. So I think that review is helpful. It's also helpful to have a live audience to practice. So if you've got a family member, a partner, a coworker, somebody who you can say, hey, let me try this story on you and see what you think. Oftentimes, if it's someone you trust, you can get some good feedback that can help you hone your story. If you don't have any friends, you can think about pets. But the caveat there, or the warning is, no matter how good or bad you are, your dog will seem like it's amazing, and no matter how good or bad you are, your cat will be bored. So there's some not as much usefulness that perhaps in the feedback, but just practice, practice, practice. That's really key. Think about changing your delivery. There's a lot of things written, a lot of things, and I'm sure as educators, a lot of you already do this, but sometimes it's really helpful to just lower your voice and make sure people are listening, or to emphasize something really strongly. Whatever, those little inflections, those little changes of volume, changes of tone, putting some life into the way you're delivering it gets people's attention or keeps their attention. Some instructors struggle with this. We've all had those instructors who are very monotone. It's like they're reading a user manual for your new toaster oven. It's about that enthralling for students when someone just speaks in a monotone, reading notes or reading slides. We got to mix it up if you want to keep anybody's attention for more than about 3 minutes. You have to do something to create some variety in your presentation. Moving on. So I mentioned before timing it. I think this is a great idea. We all have limited time. And so we want to use stories that we can fit in strategically at appropriate times to emphasize a point without dominating the classroom. We should never be in the classroom telling story after story after story, because you don't have a story for everything that you're going to cover, right? That's not an effective way. And your stories become less effective if you use them all the time. So it becomes a point of emphasis, a specific strategy to be used when you know it makes the most sense. And for that to tie into our classes, we should time it. And then when you think you have it about right, think about making it shorter. Maybe you don't need to explain the moral of the story at the end so much. Maybe you can shorten that part down. Maybe you don't need all the details that you had initially. And that should also be strategic. As I mentioned before, part of drawing your audience in, part of getting them to a point where they're going to remember this and care about it, is giving them enough detail to picture themselves in the situation. But you don't want so many obscure details that they end up distracting from the message at hand. And so that's a piece that you can think about is, are there things I can take out? Are there things I can condense? Are there ways I can make this a little more focused? The other thing is to make sure that it works. In other words, what I mean is, I said that when you're choosing your stories, we should be strategic. It should be tied to our learning objectives. And we should objectively, to the best of our ability, figure out if this is working or not. If you teach every year, or you teach multiple classes every year, if you do the same content multiple times, use those strategies and then pay attention to the assessments at the end. Did they remember that lesson? Did they remember it? Do they afterwards say that I absolutely got that part right on the test because I remember that story you told about the innovation nightmare, right? Or whatever. That's the feedback you're looking for to verify whether or not your storytelling strategy is actually educationally effective, because that's why we're doing it, or that should be why we're doing it, is because we have specifically picked this as part of my teaching plan, that I know that this is going to be the thing that drives this home. And like I alluded to before, it's not that storytelling should dominate what we do. I think it should be one piece of it. But I think we should be picking strategies in our classes to say, you know what, when I get to this part, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to play that little osmosis video clip that I got for free because I'm cheap. I don't pay for anything. I found an osmosis clip that explains CHF. I'm playing that 7-minute clip because they explained it in a way that people will pay attention to, and my students aren't listening to my voice. And as soon as that's done, I'm going to make them close their books, close their notes, and do a quick brain dump and see how much of it they remembered. And then I'm going to challenge them. And then after that, we're going to move into this thing. And over here, we're going to go through some boring PowerPoints because I really need to hit anatomy pieces. And then when it comes to patient management, I got this story in my back pocket that's going to drive this point home. You know, we should be mixing up the content, or not the content, we should be mixing up the delivery methods in our classes, because students today are much shorter attention spans than they've ever been before. Depending on who you listen to, you can get their attention on one medium in one format for somewhere around 10 to 15 minutes. And I've heard some people say it's more like 3 or 3 to 7, because this social media driven approach to getting information that most of our students live in means they're not attuned or not programmed in a way that they are able to stay attentive and engaged if the content and the delivery methods are changing. That's where I think storytelling fits in. I will come back to, we'll do some Q&A here. I'll respond to a couple comments that people made and open it up for some questions, because we do have a few minutes left. The QR code here, if you scan that, it will get you directly to a copy of this PowerPoint. So if any of that information is useful, anything that you would like to use, feel free. My personal email address for my business is there. I have a little, do some EMS education stuff on the side, Rogue EMS Education. So feel free to reach out if you have questions, comments, if you have any issues with accessing the PowerPoint, and feel free to type in the chat if you have observations, something that I missed, any key points that you think should be included in this, or questions or comments. And while I give you a chance to do that, I want to respond to the comment that William made, or the question of how do we assure that stories are culturally appropriate, DEI appropriate? I can see stories could be greatly misunderstood or lead to potential problems. And that is a phenomenal point. I don't know that I have a good answer for that question as far as how we do that, other than I'm glad you mentioned it, because I should have included this in this talk, is that what's culturally appropriate, what's appropriate consideration is, excuse me, changes over time. You know, the stories, the way that I refer to other people, to patients, to the demographics of the groups we respond to, what was acceptable ways to talk about that in 1987 is not the same as what is politically and culturally acceptable today. And we have to be very sensitive. We should be setting the example for our students of speaking about these things in a way that is going to be widely accepted, that isn't going to be offensive. And that's, you know, in the whole political correctness scheme of things, that becomes increasingly challenging. But I think it's a great point that as you're picking your story, as you're thinking about it, are there aspects of that story that you need to change? The stories I told in the 80s or 90s, I might need to talk about differently. Even just the verbiage we use. You know, when I started my career in Oakland, I was a kid from a small town in Oregon, and I went straight from that to Oakland, California. And, you know, prior to that experience, I had met one Black family in my life. And I moved to Oakland and worked in an area that was about 70% African American. And in that time period, we didn't refer to any of those folks as African American. We referred to them as Black because that was the preferred vernacular. Well, those things change over time, right? At some point it was colored, it was Negro. It's like over time, what's an acceptable and appropriate terminology changes. So we should make sure that our stories are evolving with those changes, so that we're being sensitive, we're being appropriate, that we're not using terminology that comes across as a label or as a prejudice or as a bias or anything that's going to not only potentially offend someone, but it's going to detract from your story. It's going to seem wrong. It's going to seem uncomfortable, at which point your story just became a lot less effective. Um, Gurney. Newbies call it the stretcher. I like it. Instructors are instructors even when they are providers, and without slides in the classroom, we teach with stories. Absolutely. And that was kind of the talk I did at EMS World a few years ago, was that, like I said at the start, this focus on, as EMS providers, we are the storytellers. We are the culture setters. We're the ones that bring in that new person. And do we bring in that new person and tell them a story about the most horrific thing we saw and say, yeah, this is the crap we deal with. Suck it up. Deal with it. You got to be tough if you want to be in this field. Or do we tell the stories about the time that I knew something was wrong and I had to do something about it? And I talked to my partner, and fortunately, he had my back and he said, we're going to get you help. And here's how that gets handled in our industry. What tone are we setting? Are we telling students that this is an industry where you're going to be impacted and we've got the tools and the resources to help each other be successful and survive? Or we tell people what I was told in the 80s, which is, if you can't handle it, go away. It's tough, suck it up. That was the message, right? That was the culture at that time. And we, as providers or as instructors, day to day have an opportunity to influence the direction those cultural norms go because of the stories we tell and the way we tell it. Raymond said, very new rooks call it power load. Ouch, my back. Yes. For those, I don't know if anybody on this line is as old as me, but when I started, we had to lower the gurney all the way to the ground and then lift it to put it into the ambulance and twist your back in the process. And that ended a lot of careers, unfortunately. But we thought it was cool when the legs folded up on their own. That was revolutionary. Now we've got power load and all sorts of stuff. All right. Other questions, comments before we wrap it up here? If not, I am going to wrap it up. And I know Rio has some information, which she just put in the chat, the link there for the CE information. She may have a couple more words to share. And thank you. Thank you for spending a little time with me this morning. And I hope that was somewhat helpful. And if you want to talk about this topic more, feel free to reach out. I'm always more than happy to geek out about EMS and EMS education with anybody who shares my passion. Have a great day, and we will see you around.